At 6:11 a.m. on July 27, 1945, a tractor sat motionless in a Texas wheat field, its frame wrapped in the quiet of early morning. The fighting in Europe was over, but for one farmer in central Texas, peace had not arrived. His threat didn't carry a rifle. It sat under the hood of a machine that refused to start. The farmer was Thomas Reed, 47, worn thin by years of drought, ration coupons, and the long wait for letters from his two sons serving overseas. That morning, his John Deere Model B stayed stubbornly silent. The wheat was ready barely 2 days from going bad, and dark storm clouds were pushing in from the horizon. Losing the harvest meant losing the farm. 12 men worked beside him, dressed in sun-faded khaki marked PW. German prisoners of war, captured in Tunisia, shipped across the Atlantic, processed through Oklahoma camps, and sent here to replace the American laborers who'd gone off to fight. Thomas Reed hadn't always been a man backed into a corner by failing machinery and failing weather. Before the war, his land stretched across rolling acres of wheat and pasture, quiet, predictable, and generous in the good years. Texas farms were built on rhythm: till, plant, pray for rain, and harvest before the sun turned the fields brittle. Reed had lived that rhythm since he was old enough to hold a wrench. But the war had pulled that rhythm apart, piece by piece. When America entered the conflict in 1941, the first blow to the farm wasn't enemy action, it was the sudden disappearance of workers. Young men left for the Pacific and Europe, and small towns across central Texas emptied almost overnight. Reed's two sons had gone with them, leaving only letters that arrived weeks late and carried more silence than comfort. Then came the droughts. In 1942 and 1943, rain became a rumor. Cracked soil spread across the plains, and wells dipped lower with every month. Reed rationed water the way other families rationed sugar. The government's restriction coupons made fuel scarce. Every drop had to count. He patched machinery with whatever he could find: scrap metal, wire, welded brackets, anything to squeeze another season out of tools that should have been replaced years earlier. By 1944, Texas farmers were trapped in an impossible equation: more fields to plant for the war effort, fewer hands to do it, and equipment wearing down twice as fast. Many neighbors gave up their land entirely. Others leased acreage to larger farms, watching their own fields grow wild. Reed refused to quit. He worked longer hours, rising before sunrise and often staying in the fields long after dark. The war had taken enough from him, he wouldn't let it take the farm, too. When the government announced that German prisoners of war would be assigned as agricultural laborers, Reed didn't protest like some of the locals did. He didn't have the luxury. He needed the help. The prisoners arrived in small groups, quiet and disciplined, escorted each morning from a branch camp several miles away. Reed didn't speak German, and most of the prisoners spoke little English, but farm work needed few words. He gave instructions with gestures. They followed without complaint. He respected that, and slowly, as the months passed, the presence of the PW crews stopped feeling strange. They worked hard, asked for little, and kept their distance. Reed didn't ask about their past lives, and they didn't ask about his. In the fields, under the Texas sun, they were simply men trying to endure a world at war. By the summer of 1945, the wheat stood tall again, the first good crop in years. All that was left was to bring it in before the storm arrived. A task that depended entirely on a tractor that had chosen this moment, the worst possible moment, to die. By the time Thomas Reed's tractor failed in the summer heat, German prisoners of war had become a familiar, if uneasy, presence across Texas. Few outside the state realized it, but the Lone Star countryside held one of the largest POW populations in the entire United States. More than 400,000 German soldiers had been captured in North Africa and Europe and shipped across the Atlantic. Nearly 50,000 of them lived in Texas alone, scattered across dozens of camps from Hearne to Hereford, Camp Swift to Camp Bowie. The camps sat on the edges of cotton fields, cattle ranges, and small farming towns that had never imagined themselves part of a global war. The system was a logistical marvel. Transport ships carried prisoners to East Coast ports, where they were processed and screened. Those deemed low-risk, mostly infantry, support personnel, and conscripted workers were sent by rail deep into the American interior. Texas was chosen for a simple reason: space. It had land, isolation, and an agricultural economy desperate for hands to replace the thousands of young men who had joined the U.S. Army. Under the Geneva Convention, the prisoners were guaranteed food, shelter, medical treatment, and even small daily wages, about 80 cents credited to their accounts. For many of them, conditions in Texas were safer and more humane than what they had endured under their own commanders. They slept in wooden barracks, ate 3 meals a day, and spent their hours working in the fields, sawmills, stockyards, and road crews. The locals reacted in all the ways people react to the unknown. Some were suspicious, fearful that hardened Nazis now lived within driving distance of their homes. Others saw only cheap labor. But as months turned into years, curiosity replaced fear. Texans discovered that many of these men weren't the fanatics propaganda had warned them about. They were students, machinists, mechanics, bakers, ordinary men who had been swept into a war they hadn't chosen. On the farms, the prisoners worked in silence at first. They kept their eyes down, avoiding unnecessary attention. But the land had a way of softening barriers. Shared labor, long hours, and the relentless sun blurred the lines between captor and captive. The prisoners learned the rhythm of the fields, how to stack cut wheat, how to grease a bearing, how to coax old machinery through another day of work. By 1945, the POW crews had become an inseparable part of Texas agriculture. Without them, entire counties would have faced ruined harvests. And on one small farm in central Texas, 12 of these men now stood behind a silent tractor watching a desperate farmer realize he was running out of time and options. Among the 12 prisoners working Reed's fields, one man carried a past that set him apart. A thin, quiet mechanic named Carl Weber, 27 years old, from the industrial heart of Stuttgart. Before the war scattered him across continents, Carl's world had been one of machines, precision, and routine. He worked at a Daimler plant assembling aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe, turbulent, deafening factories where pistons slammed, flywheels spun, and the smell of oil clung to every shirt. It was demanding work, but honest, predictable, familiar. The kind where a man's hands learned to feel what his eyes couldn't see. Those same hands had learned to diagnose trouble from a vibration, a misaligned gear, a faulty coil. Hands that remembered torque values without thinking. Hands that could tell steel from aluminum just by sound. But war rarely cares about the skill of the people it swallows. Carl had been drafted like millions of others, assigned to a unit far from the engines he understood. In 1943, during the collapse of the Afrika Korps in Tunisia, his unit was surrounded and forced to surrender. For Carl, the end came not with gunfire, but with an order. Drop your rifle and walk. The journey that followed was long and disorienting. Crowded transport ships crossing the Atlantic. Endless train lines across the American interior. Processing stations with unfamiliar accents and cold fluorescent lights. Then, finally, a POW camp in Oklahoma. Rows of wooden barracks, set against a sky too wide, too empty, too different from home. Carl adapted. He spoke little. He worked steadily. And when he was assigned to the Texas agricultural detail, he found a strange comfort in the fields. Farm equipment, even when battered, made more sense to him than war ever had. By the summer of 1945, he had become the unspoken problem solver among the PW crew. If a tool jammed, he fixed it. If a wagon axle squealed, he quieted it. If a belt slipped, he reset it with the calmness of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. But nothing on that farm prepared him for the sight of Thomas Reed's dead tractor, or for the moment when he finally stepped forward, broke his silence, and said the words no prisoner was expected to say, "Sir, I can fix." The machine that brought Reed to the edge of ruin wasn't exotic or rare. It was a John Deere Model B, one of the most common tractors in the American Midwest, a machine built for reliability, not drama. Thousands of farms depended on it. Reed's was no different. But even dependable machines break, and on that July morning, this one had failed in the worst possible way. The Model B was a simple two-cylinder engine, so simple that most farmers could diagnose problems by ear alone. A healthy one fired with a slow, rhythmic put-put-put, the sound of a machine that could run all day on a cup of gasoline and stubbornness. But when Reed lifted the hood earlier that morning, the signs were impossible to ignore. The ignition wire was cracked, its insulation brittle from years of heat. The magneto coil, the heart of the ignition system, had fractured completely. Without it, the engine couldn't generate the spark needed to ignite the fuel-air mixture. No spark meant no combustion. No combustion meant no harvest. In a normal year, Reed would have driven into town for replacement parts. But 1,945 wasn't normal. Wartime rationing had stripped shelves bare. Manufacturers prioritized the military. Civilian stock had been exhausted months earlier. Even if parts existed somewhere in Texas, they weren't within reach, not with storm clouds forming and the wheat running out of time. The mechanics of the failure were simple. The consequences were not. The entire harvest, weeks of work, months of hope depended on restoring an ignition system that could not be repaired with anything Reed had on hand. Or so he believed. Standing a few feet behind him was a man who had once built aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe. A man who understood coils, sparks, and metal under stress better than anyone on that field. The tractor was dead, but Carl Weber was already studying it like a puzzle he'd solved before. Carl stepped closer to the tractor, wiping his palms on his trousers as he studied the exposed engine. He didn't ask for tools, or instructions, or permission beyond the single sentence he'd already spoken. He simply looked the way only a trained mechanic could. Reed watched him with equal parts doubt and desperation. The guard leaned casually on his rifle, amused. The other prisoners kept their distance, their expressions unreadable. Carl traced the broken ignition coil with 2 fingers, then followed the cracked ignition wire to its brittle end. The diagnosis took seconds. The solution forming in his mind was unconventional, to say the least. He turned to Reed and said 2 words. "Need wire." Reed frowned. "What kind of wire?" Carl pointed to the fence line rows of weathered wooden posts strung with barbed wire. "That will work." The guard laughed out loud. "He's going to fix a tractor with that?" But Reed didn't stop him. He couldn't afford pride, or skepticism, or wasted time. "Let him try," he said. Carl borrowed a pair of pliers and cut a short length of barbed wire, stripping it down to bare metal. Then he began rebuilding the ignition coil without parts, without schematics, with nothing but wire, a nail pulled from the barn wall, and the memory of engines he'd once assembled half a world away. He shaped the wire into a tight wrap around the damaged coil, twisting it with precise tension until it hummed like a string. Then he ground the nail against a stone step, shaping it into a crude but effective contact point, sliding it into the coil with surgeon-like care. Sweat ran down his neck, darkening the cloth of his faded uniform. Every motion was deliberate, every breath measured. Finally, he stepped back and nodded. "Try now." Reed gripped the crank, turned it once nothing. A second time a cough, a puff of smoke. A third time. The engine burst to life. For a moment, no one moved. Then the guard shouted, prisoners cheered, and Reed stared at the machine that had defeated him for 2 days, now idling smoothly held together by scrap wire, a single nail, and the hands of a man he had been taught to call an enemy. That evening, once the last of the wheat wagons had been brought under cover, Reed made a decision no manual, regulation, or local custom had ever prepared him for. He walked up to the guard and asked, "Think the men could eat at the house tonight?" The sergeant blinked in surprise. He glanced at the prisoners, dusty, tired, still buzzing from the triumph of the afternoon. "It's your risk, sir," he finally said. Inside the Reed farmhouse, the dining table was long, plain, and built for work, not ceremony. Mrs. Reed ladled out bowls of beans, set down baskets of cornbread, and brewed coffee strong enough to keep anyone awake through a storm. The prisoners filed in quietly, removing their caps out of instinct. They sat with cautious posture, unsure of how to behave in a room that smelled of home rather than war. Carl took a seat near the end of the table. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He studied the warm glow of the oil lamp as if it were something he hadn't seen in years. Conversation began slowly. Reed spoke about the harvest, about the weather turning, about the letters from his sons, one fighting in France, the other still missing somewhere in the Philippines. Missus. Reed listened carefully, her gaze softening when she glanced at the men around her table. Then Carl spoke. His voice was quiet but steady. He told them about Stuttgart, about nights when the air raid sirens screamed without end, about the sky glowing orange as entire blocks burned, about families sleeping in cellars while the world above them vanished beneath falling steel. He didn't ask for sympathy. He simply spoke of a life interrupted. At one point, Reed's youngest boy shuffled into the room holding a small wooden toy truck with a loose axle. Without hesitation, he walked straight to Carl. "Fix?" the boy asked. Carl smiled for the first time that day. He took a nail from his pocket, a leftover from the tractor repair, tightened the axle, and handed the truck back. The boy beamed. And for a brief, fragile moment, the room felt lighter. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, carrying the promise of rain. Inside, across a simple wooden table, something quieter and harder to define had been repaired too. The next morning, Reed's fields woke before the sun. The repaired tractor fired on the first pull, its steady rhythm echoing across the wheat like a heartbeat the farm had nearly lost. The prisoners stepped into their rows with practiced efficiency, stacking sheaves, loading wagons, guiding the team through a harvest that could not afford a single wasted minute. By midday, the storm clouds that had threatened the season began to thicken on the horizon, turning blue sky into steel gray. Everyone worked faster. Sweat darkened shirts, straw clung to boots, and the rising wind pushed dust across the fields in long, restless waves. But hour by hour, wagon by wagon, the harvest moved closer to safety. For the PW crew, this was more than field labor. It was a rare moment when their work felt meaningful, when the monotony of captivity gave way to something with visible stakes. Each wagon hauled under cover before the storm was proof that, at least for one American family, their presence mattered. When the final load rolled beneath the barn roof, the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm arrived as a sheet of water, hammering the tin roof and drowning the fields in minutes. But below the racket, the prisoners could hear something else. The quiet, unmistakable sound of relief in Reed's voice. Back at the branch camp, the routine resumed. The compound was a cluster of tar paper barracks, surrounded by a double fence and a guard tower that oversaw everything but interfered with little. Life was predictable. Roll call at dawn, work assignments, lunch in the mess, evenings spent playing cards, mending clothes, or writing letters home that might take months to arrive. Some men collected scraps of wood to carve toys or small figurines. Others stitched together makeshift orchestras, using pots, spoons, and borrowed instruments from sympathetic Texans. The camp library, stocked with donated books, was always full. In many ways, it was a strange island of order in a world collapsing elsewhere. Outside the fences, Texans had grown used to seeing these men. By 1945, the initial fear had faded. Store owners greeted PW crews politely. Some farmers left apples or cold water along fence lines. A few bold children waved at the marching columns as guards looked on with resigned amusement. Most prisoners counted the days until repatriation. A few dreaded it. But for Carl, the harvest on the Reed farm became something different, something he carried back with him to the camp that night. It wasn't pride, exactly. And it wasn't victory. It was the feeling that, for the first time in years, he had been useful again. And that feeling would shape the next part of his journey, a journey that would lead him far from Texas and into a homeland he no longer recognized. 2 months after the harvest, Carl's name appeared on Transport List No. 217, one of dozens of repatriation orders issued as the U. Army prepared to send German prisoners home. When Reed drove out to the farm road to say goodbye, the farewell needed no speeches. They shook hands, firm, quiet, deliberate, and Reed pressed a small photograph into Carl's palm, the family standing beside the tractor he had brought back to life. "If you ever make it back here," Reed said, "there'll be work waiting." Carl looked at the photograph for a long moment. "Thank you," he replied, "for letting me feel useful again." The journey home was long, 31 days across the Atlantic on a troop transport converted for returning POWs. The ship rolled through storms, its decks crowded with men who stared at the horizon with a mixture of dread and hope. None knew what waited for them. When the vessel finally reached Bremerhaven, the shoreline did not resemble home so much as the remains of one. The docks were jagged skeletons of twisted steel. Warehouses lay flattened, their roofs caved in like crushed tin cans. Cranes stood frozen in place, rust spreading across their frames like old bloodstains. The rail journey to Stuttgart brought little comfort. Town after town passed by in silence, streets choked with rubble, factories burned out to their foundations, mothers carrying water in dented pails, children scavenging coal from abandoned freight yards. The war was over, but the aftermath was still unfolding in slow motion. Stuttgart had suffered some of the heaviest bombing of the war. Where Carl once walked to work, entire neighborhoods had vanished. The Daimler plant, where he'd spent years assembling engines, was a blackened shell. Fire had gutted the assembly halls. Only fragments of machinery remained, half buried under collapsed beams. His parents' apartment was nothing more than a cratered foundation. Neighbors told him they hadn't survived the air raid of March 1944. It was information delivered calmly, but it cut through him with quiet, devastating precision. With nothing left to return to, Carl began to rebuild life one small step at a time. He found work repairing bicycles for families who owned nothing else that moved. Then tractors began arriving from rural villages, machines limping through the ruins, brought by farmers who had heard whispers of a young mechanic who could coax life out of broken engines. He rented a small workshop, patched the roof himself, and painted a simple sign above the entrance: Weber Machine Service. He kept one thing on the wall, Reed's photograph. When customers asked, he only said, "A friend from far away. A man who trusted me when I had nothing." But even as he rebuilt, Carl sensed an emptiness that Germany could not fill, a quiet absence he had carried since leaving Texas, and one that was about to echo back across the ocean in a way he never expected. In May of 1947, nearly 2 years after Carl stepped off the Reed property for the last time, a brown envelope arrived at the farmhouse. Mrs. Reed recognized the handwriting before she even opened it, precise, careful, and unmistakably foreign. Inside was a short letter. "Dear Mr. Reed, I am home. Germany is broken but alive. When I fix engines, I still hear the Texas wind. Thank you for the day you trusted me. Carl Weber." She framed it and set it on the mantel, where the dust of the plains never quite settled. Over the years, the ink faded, but the words never lost their weight. Life moved on. Camp Bowie was dismantled, its barracks torn down to make way for new housing. The fences rusted away, the guard towers disappeared, and the fields grew over the paths where prisoners once marched at dawn. Most people forgot that enemy soldiers had ever walked those roads, but some memories don't vanish. They simply wait. In 1984, a Dallas journalist researching POW history tracked down Thomas Reed Jr., now an old man with hands roughened by decades of harvests. When asked about the story, he led the reporter to the barn. There sat the same John Deere Model B. Its paint was sun-faded, its tires cracked with age, but the barbed wire repair, Carl's repair, still held fast after nearly 40 years. Reed Jr. wrapped his fingers around the crank and gave it a single pull. A cough, a sputter. Then the engine came alive, steady and sure. "Still works," he said quietly. Guess he fixed more than just metal that day. Across Texas, many former POWs built new lives. Some married local women. Some returned as immigrants. Some opened small businesses that lasted generations. Carl Weber was not among them. He died in 1972, buried in Stuttgart. When his nephew cleared out the workshop, he found Reed's photograph still hanging above the bench. On its back, written in German, were 5 simple words: Frieden beginnt mit Vertrauen. Peace begins with trust. And if you listen closely in those quiet Texas fields, you can still hear the hum of an old engine and the echo of a moment when an enemy's hands turned a wrench and something far larger turned with it.